Well, we're going to have a lot of fun in this discussion. We recently had Professor Bruce German on with Professor Bruce Hammock, both of which are at UC Davis, where they investigate the role of food and different lipids. Now, Bruce German is with us today for a follow up discussion. He's a chemist, he's a food scientist, and I want to read from his site because he has an interesting way of putting this. He says, milk is the model that he uses as a genetic blueprint for foods to support health. And so we're going to kind of dive into this and learn more about his work. Joining me now as well as Tucker Goodrich, who is our nutrition researcher friend and blogger at Yelling Stop. And so welcome both of you for another discussion.
Pleasure as
Delighted
always.
to be here. Yeah.
Well, very good. So Tucker, why don't you start off what you're thinking here?
Well, we talked with you and Professor Hammock, and we focused a little bit more on Professor Hammock's interests, which range more on the bug and pesticide things, and he's gotten into human health sort of almost inadvertently. But food and nutrition has really been your specialty all along. Is that correct? I know he asked you to be part of that discussion because you were his go-to guy on questions of human health and lipids.
Yeah, that's right. I've been a food geek, scientifically, recreationally, literally since I started my schooling, and it's just gotten more interesting every year.
So what got you into being so interested in food science?
Mainly the translational aspects. Actually, I am no young dude anymore, but even back then, it was obvious that diet was important and was not being studied adequately, and that if you did study it, then the potential was for your research to be of utility to improving human health and the human condition broadly. So that has proven to be true. Our research discoveries have been brought to practice faster than they would have been if we'd have been in a more esoteric field.
And what do you think is one of the most significant findings that you've seen translated into practice of yours?
Sure. Well, to just digress briefly, and I think I warned you last time, my daughters would tell you, do not start that man talking. He will never shut up. But so with that caveat.
Well, yeah, here we go.
Here we go. But we studied the mother-infant pair and lactation as this magnificent product of selective pressure of evolution of a complete and nourishing diet for infants. And in that conflict of the mother-infant, the mother is literally dissolving herself to make a complete diet for her infant. Everything costs her. If it doesn't profit the infant, it'll be lost to evolution. But if anything in milk helps that healthy baby to succeed, develop, in essence, prevent disease, it's hard to imagine anything that's under more positive selective pressure. So That was our model. Just take milk apart and figure out how it works to make healthy babies. The targets are very attractive because they're the targets of health, which is one of the great challenges to therapeutics, is if you take a disease-based model, which is typically what we do, what's the cause of a disease? How do I diagnose it? How do I cure it? Prevention is a very different thing.
Which just to note for the listeners, is great if you're looking at, say, nutritional deficiencies, which was big in the early part of the 20th century when they were widespread. But most of the gross ones, we could debate about that, but most of the gross deficiencies have been treated through food, through better nutrition or through like adding iron to wheat. We've addressed a lot of those things. So now we're looking at like, okay, what's optimal, which is, I guess, more your model.
Exactly right. So how milk makes babies, in essence, healthier. So how do you make a healthy person healthier? How do you make a healthy baby healthier? Those mechanisms of action, those targets of efficacy are discoverable in studying milk. But the other thing that's very attractive, of course, is the safety dossier. Milk is all a baby eats. And so milk and the targets on which it acts are also safe. So we can be confident that by pursuing milk, we will get this simultaneously effective and safe strategy. So in that model, one of the things that we looked at was something that was very perplexing, is human breast milk is full of undigestible matter.
Right.
Why would mothers dissolve themselves to make poop in their babies? So first, what is it? It's complex sugar polymers called oligosaccharides. Babies have no enzymes to access the sugars, so they go right through the baby. So we asked the question, well, if they're not helping the baby, what are they good for? We thought, well, maybe they feed bacteria. So we tested, do these oligosaccharides in breast milk feed bacteria? Well, they don't. Bacteria don't have the capability to access the sugars any more than babies do, which is part of the genius. Because then we found one strain of Bifidobacteria, Bifidobacteria longum, subspecies Infantis, recognized actually originally by the French clinician Tissier in the 19th century.
And that name, Infantis, suggests that it was discovered in the human baby.
It was discovered in a poop of a breastfed baby. And it's a brilliant idea of evolution. The mother literally recruits another life form to babysit her baby. And she feeds this very specific strain, so it dominates. And so breastfed babies that have this bacteria, their lower intestine is full of a single strain. It protects the baby from pathogens. It fuels the baby. It nourishes the baby. It educates the baby's immune system. It's a really good idea. And so that discovery led us to look around the world. How's that doing? And unfortunately, not well. So
how's what doing?
How's the bacteria doing?
Oh, the Infantis strain.
Yeah, our baby's getting it, and it turns out we've largely eliminated it. So the combination of antibiotics, cesarean sections, infant formula, and restricted duration of breastfeeding, et cetera, is babies don't get this bacteria anymore.
What is the restricted? What is your definition of restricted breastfeeding in that?
Well, humans anthropologically would breastfeed for a couple of years minimum. Right. And today, babies are lucky if their mother is able to breastfeed for 3 to 6 months. I mean, if aliens came down to this planet, the first thing they'd say is, "What are you doing with your babies?" so mothers and babies should be a priority.
Well, according to the Pentagon, we may have that conversation sooner than later, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Maybe
we're gonna
no
have to answer for these things sooner than we all thought.
It's no longer hypothetical. Okay.
Yeah.
But anyways, so if you have breast milk for only 3 to 6 months, is that not enough time to get that inoculation of that particular strain that's very teaching to the baby's immune system and so forth?
Well, and that means that that babies only have it for a narrow window of time, and then they can't pass it on to other babies, et cetera. So if you look, how do microbes pass through a population ecologically? Historically, it was easy to get this bacteria into babies at birth, et cetera. And now, oops. And as this bacteria has been going down for the past more than half century in around the world, especially in the wealthiest parts, where we have antibiotics and treatments that do wonderful things, but they have as an inadvertent side effect, they kill off this bacterium. And so while it's been going away, allergy, atopy, asthma, all of the things that we recognize as inappropriately educated immune system, autoimmune diseases, have been going up.
Right.
So it looks like we made a mistake. So the simple solution was to ask, could you put it back? If you get the bacteria, give it to a baby. And we did this first in premature babies in the neonatal intensive care unit, because they're the ones at the greatest risk of inappropriate bacteria. And it's amazing. You give it back to the babies, and away it goes. As long as you're getting breast milk and the food for it, it grows and does its thing. So
women are, how is this the obvious question here is how is this bacteria getting into breast milk in the first place? And if it's coming out of the mother's body, are you finding that it's been eliminated by antibiotic treatments to the mother?
Yeah, actually probably doesn't come through the breast milk.
Okay.
So this is not unique to humans, this idea of transferring bacteria from mother to infant. And probably not a politically correct conversation to have, but if you look at mammals, live birth provides an unusual advantage, is the mother transfers her bacteria to the baby.
Right.
And and anatomically, all mammals basically poop on their babies.
Right.
And we didn't think about that until recently, but now we realize, ooh, that may be a better idea than we thought.
Well, it's not a hygienic environment if you're giving birth out in the jungle or something, obviously.
Right. And so it looks like that's one of the things that live birth provides mammals, is this ingenious microbial transfer. And so once you give this bacteria to babies once and breastfeed, then whoop, the bacteria grows and away it goes. And as long as the mother breastfeeds, this bacteria continues to help her baby.
So is that the only way that so even if a mother gives birth naturally and everything, if there's no poop on the baby, it doesn't get the bacteria to begin with, or you can still get it somehow else?
You can get it from other places, but actually, because antibiotics are so deadly to this bacteria, that if a woman has had antibiotics at any point before in her life, before she gives birth to her baby, she's pretty much lost the bacteria.
Mm.
Wow.
So you can see why we lost it. Evolution didn't account for the possibility of antibiotics.
It'd be nice if doctors told that to people before they gave antibiotics for the smallest things.
Well, typically you're getting antibiotics because you really need them.
Oh yeah,
ideally anyway.
Absolutely, and the secret is not to get rid of antibiotics. The secret is to put the bacteria back.
Right.
And so this, in a translational sense, the faculty who had made these series of discoveries got together with the University of California, Davis, and launched a small company to make the bacteria available for babies. And
as a supplement.
Right. And so in that, can you bring this science to practice? Yeah, you can. And so we've done that for this bacteria for babies. We've done it for enzymes. We've done it for, because milk actually has enzymes in it to help the baby digest proteins and lipids.
The lactase enzyme to digest the lactose, famously.
Actually, babies produce that in their intestinal epithelia. What they don't have is proteases to digest the protein when they're very young. This is particularly important for premature babies. So lo and behold, milk has enzymes that are inactive in the mother and activate in the baby. so milk is self-digesting.
And what happens to those enzymes when you homogenize milk, or not homogenize, when you pasteurize milk?
You kill them.
Right. Okay.
Most of them don't survive. Yeah. So, so now we're working on ways to process breast milk so you don't inactivate the enzymes, so that especially premature babies, again, get milk in its maximum potency, if you will. But so you can see how the more you look at milk, the more you realize, yeah, this is how milk works, and you can bring that to practice relatively quickly. And that's true for babies, but in terms of being able to digest proteins, you can't digest proteins very well when you're very young, and you can't digest proteins very well when you're old. And if you don't digest proteins, that's not a good thing.
Well, that's one of the biggest health problems with older people, is insufficient protein intake.
Right.
And I presume, obviously, if you also can't digest it, that just makes things worse.
It makes things worse. And it's a sort of a left-right combination, is you don't get the protein, amino acids to keep building your muscle. So you get in the negative nitrogen balance. But then
which for the audience, negative nitrogen balance basically means you're breaking down your own muscle, which we don't want to do. It's what sarcopenia is basically.
That's what happens with the elderly folks when they lose their musculature, right?
Exactly right. But then the proteins, because they're not digested, they continue on. They arrive in the lower intestine, which for humans is full of different kinds of bacteria, and it shifts its community structure depending on the food. So if you put a lot of protein in, then proteobacteria are stimulated, and a lot of those are gram negative. They produce endotoxin that causes inflammation. You get a systemic inflammation because of it. And what does that accelerate? Muscle turnover and more protein loss. So yeah, digestion protein is important to do. And milk has provided us a clue as to how we can help the elderly. Ask your mother.
What's causing
yet another instance in which we start off, we end up in the same state we start off in, right? That's
exactly right. Yeah. So it makes sense to nourish you in the same kind of way. And your mother helps you digest protein. So why can't we develop enzymes that do the same thing?
So what causes the loss of those enzymes in the elderly? Is there food? Is it a dietary source or something that's causing this?
It's a variety of things, but as we get older, several things. We don't produce as much stomach acid, so the environment is not as good. We don't produce as much enzymes per unit weight. We are not signaling as well, so the signals that said we've just eaten don't work as well. So the elderly are just not quite up to speed.
Is that because of the proliferation of like senescent cells? Is that what's causing some of that? Or
to an extent, yeah.
But some of it's just aging. We're all the longevity scientists don't like to admit this, but we do all seem programmed to die ultimately.
Yeah. So the question is, can we as the aging scientists say, square off the life curve, make you as healthy as possible, as long as possible.
Right.
And so getting better protein, better digestion helps babies. Probably going to help the rest of us.
Well, that's pretty amazing stuff, I gotta say. I was not expecting that you were going to get to where you got to from that simple little question. That's really quite remarkable. That you would think a small thing as a nursing mother could have such a huge impact on potential for health throughout life.
Yeah, and I think we're tip of the iceberg. I think that the more we study milk scientifically, the more we'll understand about lifelong health.
Right. Now, you had also mentioned in our discussion with Professor Hammock something about how mother's milk the mother produces milk, and most of the variables in milk are pretty highly controlled, but some of them are not and depend more on the environment. Could you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating aspect. So if you eat protein from fish or from plants, it's not like those proteins go into the milk, right? The mother digests them in amino acids and she synthesizes milk proteins. Same thing is true of carbohydrate. In fact, most things in milk are from the mammary gland. But
so they're produced exclusively for the baby.
Right.
Right.
And about 50% of the fatty acids and the lipids are the same way. The mammary gland makes them. But about 50% of the fat in human breast milk comes directly from our diet, which presumably is in part to make sure that the essential fatty acids, the fatty acids that neither the mother nor the baby can make, transfer successfully. But there are other things about that process that are fascinating. So fat-soluble components transfer to milk. And the most obvious of those are the flavors. And so you don't think about that so much, but yeah, food has flavor. We smell it. We have to learn to like or dislike flavors in our diet. And mammals, the mother educates her infant about the flavors in her diet, the food she's eating, through milk. So your mother is teaching you what foods to eat and like before you can even eat them.
That's incredible.
It's just amazing. And it because I mean, what people don't really think about so much as is from an evolutionary perspective, the strongest selective pressure basically throughout evolution is to avoid being food. If you're delicious and nutritious, you do not have a long future. Predators will get you. And so all organisms have strategies to avoid being food. And plants, it's toxins, it's bark and thorns and all sorts of strategies. And so finding a diet in this hostile environment isn't easy. And mammals have to educate their offspring in how to do that. And so having milk started off by cueing the in essence the baby. Ooh, I smelled that before. That must be good. So it's a very impressive idea. It has consequences. That if a mother is exposed to lipid-soluble drugs or toxins, those can get in the milk too. So that's why it's important that mothers.
Can you give us an example of something that might go through?
Oh, sure. Caffeine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oops. Uh-oh.
But the mammary gland does a pretty good job of screening, right? So, but not perfect. So.
Right, and obviously, no infant needs caffeine in its diet. So.
Or recreational drugs, or a variety of drugs.
Yeah, pharmaceutical medications for certain issues the mother may have, may be going into the child. Because I've heard reports of mothers saying like, "Oh, my child must be lactose intolerant. They just can't handle nursing. They have diarrhea and stuff whenever they're nursing." And I wonder if it could be medications they're taking or something like that. You know?
Yeah, and so this is one of the areas that, unfortunately, if we were to say what are the highest priorities for scientific research funding, breast milk mothers and babies are not at the top. They're not in the middle. They're at the bottom. There are more studies, scientific studies, on the composition of grapes than there is in the composition of human breast milk. Ouch.
Right.
Well, you can't patent breast milk or anything.
Yeah.
Exactly. But you can make replacements. Obviously, there are situations where you can't, where for whatever reason a woman isn't able to breastfeed, and we've got synthetic replacements. I mean, when you were talking about the microbiome requirement for babies, one of the things that sprung to mind is it's a huge problem in the developing world. You know, breast milk replacements are supposed to be made with sterilized water, because otherwise you're giving the baby a big load of pathogens. But in practice, that's often not done, and you're just literally giving, you know, the baby, you're mixing a breast form or a milk formula with stream water or whatever and giving it to the kid, and they have a pretty bad outcome.
And now we know it's a double jeopardy, because if they're not getting breast milk, then they're not feeding the right bacteria and having that more natural protection. So, yeah.
Well, what is causing the problem with children having, you know, inflammation and bowel issues when they're drinking mother's milk? Is that from the lack of the bacteria that's been wiped out of a lot of people, or is it something else?
A big problem turns out to be that we've lost this bacteria. Oops. And I mean, humans have done this for lots of things. We do something, and then we realize when it's gone, uh-oh, shouldn't have done that. And then, of course, the question is, can you put it back? The forests of Western Canada and California have trees that are 300 feet tall, and magnificent things going way up in the sky. Turns out that there's an unusual meteorological condition. There's fog banks in those two places, and they go in on the coast, off the coast, in the coast, off the coast every day, but they don't rain. So the trees go way up and pull the water out of the fog and irrigate the whole forest. But of course, settlers came and they looked up and they saw lumber, and they cut it all down. And unfortunately, we can't put those trees back 300 feet tall. The good news is we inadvertently lost the bacteria. You can put it back.
Well, is there an age range to put it back before you can't put it back anymore?
As long as they're breastfeeding, you can put it back. But the earlier you can start, the more you can help the baby's immune system. That seems to be one of the critical aspects of first few weeks and months of development. Is babies basically are born sterile with a completely naive immune system. And of course, they're birthed into the mud. And they have to learn immunologically about their environment. What should we attack, kill as pathogenic, and what should we leave alone because it's food? That decision is very complicated. And it turns out that having the right bacteria in the gut, where the immune system is making these decisions, is really important. And now we're realizing that.
How would someone go about knowing if their child doesn't have that bacteria and needs to get it supplemented? Is there a test that one has to do, or what?
Well, they're complicated tests, but it turns out that human breast milk is about 10% of calories as oligosaccharides.
These
that means it's about as much
things that you mentioned before.
Yeah, that don't feed the baby.
Anyway.
Yeah, right. And they feed the bacteria. Well, that's about as many calories as protein. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's as important to feed the bacteria in the baby as the baby. So now we know, oh my gosh, the microbiome in all of us, really important. And we should be looking at that. But if the baby is breastfeeding, all those oligosaccharides are going through. If there's no bacteria to digest them, then those oligosaccharides come out in the poop, literally. And so breastfed babies that don't have the right bacteria have as many as 7 diapers a day. And if they get the right bacteria, then boom, that immediately changes to 1 a day.
Wow.
So actually fathers can tell.
Which answers a question every parent has had. What did we do before?
What did we do to that baby?
And I guess the answer was the baby took care of that, just didn't do as much business, and you didn't have to worry so much about diapers.
So so for folks listening, is it one of those things that, again, if you're not having runny stools, that means your baby or infant, if they're still nursing, has got the bacteria, or is there a test that needs to be done? Or if you have it, or if the baby already has the bacteria, does it harm the child to give them the supplemental bacteria?
Well, it's the exact same strain, so you can give them more. It won't do them any harm. But actually, we did a survey of babies in the U.S. and in Asia, and only about 3% of babies have the bacteria. So It's pretty well gone.
So now, okay, everybody is going to want to know, is this bacterial, you mentioned this bacterial supplement's available now. Can you tell every breastfeeding mother out here how to get this? Because I think there's going to be a rush after this podcast.
Well, I mean, it turns out that there are lots of bacteria out there called probiotics.
Right.
Unfortunately, they are not specific for babies, not specific for breast milk. We didn't invent this. right? We didn't, we just discovered this. And so there are places in the world that have not had antibiotics that are doing fine.
Right.
And that's ironically the places where they don't know what allergy is.
Of course. Right.
Yeah. So, but the company is Evolve Biosystems. The product is Evivo. And yeah, they can see what mothers say about it. It's sort of amazing. If a baby has colic, then within 24 hours.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
But again, it's not an invention by us. It's evolution. And
how essential is this bacteria to proper health for long-term health of a child? I mean, of a human.
We're just getting into that, and obviously, it's really a confounded problem because a breastfed baby is much more intimate with its mother, and so it's learning things from its mother more. Milk has other things than nourishing a baby. I mean, milk transfers the immune system of the mother to the baby for the first few days of life, which is, again, absolutely ingenious.
Right.
Because the things that the baby is going to get exposed to, the mother already has. And so she's built up her protection. She transfers that. And they've even shown that with COVID antibodies. I mean, this is just absolutely brilliant. But of course, in order for it to work, the mother's immune, in essence, antibody components go into milk, but the baby has to have a somewhat porous gut. So these big components go in. And then the gut all closes up. And so it's that window of time that's key. And that's why you want babies to start breastfeeding right away. And then the bacteria comes at the same time. It pushes all of the unpleasant bacteria out, and away they go. But
now this reminds me of another. We make yogurt with the L. reuteri variant, which is supposed, and it's nice yogurt. I don't know. I haven't really noticed any health difference since we started making this, but this story there is that this bacteria is supposedly killed by linoleic acid in the diet and has been nearly wiped out. And that similarly to what you're telling us about this Infantis bacteria, the idea is that adding it back helps your microbiome be a little happier. Have you looked into that, or can you talk about the changing fatty acid composition of mother's breast milk and if that could have any impact on this?
Well, actually, we have looked at milk, and milk is actually protective of the Bifidobacterium infantis.
Okay.
And it which means that it's selectively antimicrobial and supportive of bacteria, which is something we would love to be able to do. Antibiotics are non-selective. For the most part, they kill pathogens that we want them to, but they kill other things as well. We would like to be more selective, and we don't know how to do that. And milk is helping teach us how that can be done. The current group of probiotics out there were not really selected for efficacy. They were really selected for safety. And kudos to that industry. They've done a good job of making safe live bacterial products. But now we have to realize, well, efficacy is really what we'd like from these things. And so far, they're not. And one of the reasons they're not is because they really don't grow in us. Right? So probiotics, we take them live, but they just go right through. And since we have, anywhere approaching half a pound of live bacteria in us all the time, a few milligrams of a probiotic, it's not really going to do much.
It can't outcompete what's already in there.
Right. And actually, originally, the thought was that probiotics did colonize. And so 30 years ago, that was the thinking. But fortunately for those companies, they didn't colonize, and so they had no efficacy in that respect. And why I say good news is if they had been colonizing bacteria, they would basically have infected us for life with an industrial microbe, and we probably would have sued them for. so what you really want is to be able to guide the microbial composition and function according to your life stage, your life activities, and interesting. That's what milk does. So,
Right.
so at birth, babies are basically sterile. They get inoculated by the birth process with lots of bacteria, and then this oligosaccharide material from milk feeds one strain, and so it dominates. And babies are basically over 90% this single strain of bacteria in their gut as long as the mother breastfeeds.
But that's
of course, when
the one we don't have, or that's the one we still do.
Yeah, that's the one we lost.
So
And
90. So it's supposed to be 90% of our, but we don't have it.
We don't have it.
So how are we alive?
But
we're keeping the diaper business going.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those difficult things that is not life or death like an essential nutrient. It's just better life or not, better protected or not.
Well, and there's a great book by two doctors, Burkett and Trowell, who Burkett was the guy who introduced what's known as the fiber hypothesis. And they wrote a book called Western Diseases, Their Emergence and Prevention. And these were all doctors who practiced in, quote unquote, primitive areas as Western culture came in. And they have a chapter in this, and they look at all these different diseases, and they have a chapter in autoimmune diseases. And it's really short because they say autoimmune diseases were unknown in these populations prior to the introduction of the Western diet and lifestyle. Oops.
Oops. Yeah. But so what milk learned how to do was to raise the number of bacteria, in essence, as long as the baby's breastfeeding. And then at the end of breastfeeding, the food for the bacteria goes down, and so the bacteria goes down. And then we transition into a different microbial community that grows on the things that we eat and don't digest. But realizing how important that is to get the right bacteria and to feed them means that we can now take advantage of what basically is another organ in us.
Right. So I don't want to get onto too much. I mean, this is an amazing discussion that we're having here, but I don't want to get on too much of a sideline and this whole topic of the microbiome. I've looked at enough of this research where it relates to adults. They've looked at the microbiome of Westerners and of people with various disease states, and then they went and looked at the Hadza. And my personal conclusion was we just don't know enough about this in the adults to really do much now. Okay, so that's your conclusion as well. So I don't want to go off on a whole long tangent if the answer is we just don't know enough yet. I mean, there's things like fecal transplants for C. difficile infections, which are quite miraculous, although they have had problems because, you don't know what's in the poop necessarily when you change it from one person to another. And they've had induction of obesity and other things that you wouldn't really want to have happen. It's a fascinating field, but it is literally an infant field, I guess is the best way to say it, and should probably be limited to infants at the moment.
Yeah.
Is there any, there's been a rise I've seen in the studies saying that there's been a rise in demineralization and teeth structure for these baby teeth. Is that because of this issue of this lack of bacteria, or is that totally unrelated? Because the porous teeth that babies are born with and so forth. And
great question. We don't know. I mean, again, I would love to stand here and say the highest priority for scientific research funding has been mothers and babies. Because if you get a baby right, you will be healthy lifelong. So whatever, in essence, life potential we have, it's maximally affected in those 1,000 days before the mother has her baby and the 1,000 days after that baby is born. And so we should have prioritized the mother-infant pair and give every boy and girl the maximum potential that they can have. We don't even know how milk works. So we should prioritize that.
So we still don't know how milk works.
No. Well, and to lipids. Saturated fat is considered the great evil of the diet, and yet breast milk has saturated fatty acids. And the more carefully you look at saturated fatty acids, the more you realize each one has a discrete function in the diet. It has to be there at the right dose, the right composition, but it's valuable. And
right. So saying fat is bad or fat is good is a gross oversimplification.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really and you all know, as probably better than I, how many political, scientific, commercial variables have affected the public's knowledge of that, et cetera. But
what is the ratio between like the saturated fat and monounsaturated fat in human breast milk, and then the PUFA? How much of that? What's the ratio of those three fats usually?
Well, about saturated mono is about 1-to-1, and the polys somewhere around half of that. But there's a fascinating aspect of this, in that most of the fatty acids, even if they're from the diet, are pretty well regulated. So you don't see spectacular ranges. But for one fatty acid, you do, and that's linoleic acid.
Okay.
I have no idea why that is. So there are babies that are getting 5 times as much linoleic acid than their milk, breast milk, because their mothers eat so much. And so there are 2 alternatives to explain it that we can think of.
And they've looked at that specific fat in hunter-gatherer, specifically the Chimane group down in Bolivia, and they have far less than an American woman would.
Yeah. Well, you could
but
imagine
it would only be a problem if that fat was somehow bioactive.
Yeah, if only you. Yeah. Oops. So one possibility is it's so good that you just accumulate as much as you could, and so there was no screen, or it was so rare that you never built a screen to protect babies because it was impossible from an evolutionary perspective.
Interesting. So that's what I was
you
wanting to know.
You never encounter high amounts, so there was no need to filter them out.
Yeah, that's what I was wanting to know, because you were talking about how efficient the filter of the breast milk is for getting rid of stuff that the mother doesn't want to transition over to the baby. But what you're maybe suggesting in this hypothesis is that the very recent introduction of this high amount of linoleic acid in the form of these industrial seed oil based products has been so recent that there's no evolutionary adaptation built in to screen it out.
Right. And remember, it is essential. So the mother has to find it in her diet and tissues and get some to her baby, because without it, the skin doesn't produce an adequate barrier. So, so you need some.
Eye function, brain development. I mean, they're clearly
benefits.
Yes.
But the dose needed to get them is really tiny, and consistent with what its natural abundance in the food supply has been throughout evolutionary history.
So for our audience again,
oops.
So for our audience, what again is where does it need to be? What's the tiny dose, and what are we usually seeing when you're looking at this linoleic acid?
The estimates are about 0.2% of calories are needed to provide. The most abundant need is for skin. So you really need to be able to be water insoluble.
Right. So the largest organ. So, okay, that would make sense. But it's still a small requirement.
Oh, it's really quite small. And remember, Paracelsus said this 500 years ago, founding the field of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. And that's true for acute toxicity. It's also true for chronic toxicity. High levels of things that are beneficial at low levels can be deleterious. And that looks like what we've done, with linoleic acid.
Right. So now you and a gentleman we've discussed before, Amir Taha, and some colleagues released a paper last year, if I remember correctly, looking at oxidized, polyunsaturated, and other fats in breast milk. What can you describe that paper to us and conclusions that you came to?
Sure. So we were interested. So Amir is a brilliant young scientist, just a spectacular individual, and he's been studying this group of signaling lipids that were very difficult to even detect before, and they have two challenges. They're there in low abundance, and they're there for a short time. And he discovered that there's another complexity: is your body sort of stores them in a ready-to-use form, but captured in the structure of complex lipids,
phospholipids.
And so
which are components of every cell wall, essentially.
Yeah.
So they're always, these fats are always there, like bullets in a chamber, ready to go when they're needed.
Right, and it makes perfect sense. And I think Amir is going to be famous for that brilliant contribution to understanding that your tissues are ready for trouble with this signaling system, as you say, parked, ready to go. So we wanted to know, does your mother do it too? In essence,
right.
Does she transfer this signaling system to her infant by virtue of the lipids in milk? So are there this class of slightly oxidized signaling fatty acids in breast milk? And lo and behold, yes, there are. So again, remember what you want to be able to do as an infant. You want to be able to react quickly and effectively to stress. Not too little, not too much. And so the question is milk helping the baby with that? And the evidence is pretty good now. Yeah. That the milk lipids are a signaling communication system from mother to baby. And that's what we're beginning to look at very carefully, because if that's true, then that's going to be very personal.
Now, and that's
what do you mean by personal?
I mean,
what do you mean by personal there? I just wanted
to. So the mother's stress level, microbially, etc., will influence the extent to which she's signaling stress to her infant.
I see. Okay.
So it's going to vary time of day, month after birth. I mean, it's a fascinating new area that we couldn't even have imagined until Amir came and said, I can measure this for you.
And so this, I mean, we've heard about epigenetic effects of diet on mother and then the effects that it has on the offspring. And this could be a way of communicating those states to the offspring. So I notice when we just talked to you last, we were talking about this dreadful chemical leukotoxin, which seems to be implicated in killing people from ARDS. And I note that this dreadful toxin is present in breast milk. So the dose makes the poison. It's a signaling molecule at the level it's in breast milk and then goes crazy under certain circumstances.
Is leukotoxin produced by linoleic acid, or it's in addition, it's a separate component that's coming from the seed oil consumption?
No, leukotoxin is a form of linoleic acid. So linoleic acid is slightly oxidized, and very stereospecifically, certain linoleic acid derivatives are leukotoxin. But it's one of those classic examples of you want your immune system to be ready to respond, and leukotoxin can help with that. So you wouldn't call it leukotoxin when it's telling the infant, hey, get over there and fix that. But if it's an overwhelming amount and causes the whole immune system to go into, in essence, a catastrophic reaction, and we know the immune system is capable of that. Inflammation, anaphylaxis, sepsis, necrotizing enterocolitis. These are conditions where you literally put an individual in a life-threatening state because of their own immune system. Mm-hmm. So you can overstimulate the immune system. And that's why leukotoxins can be good at one dose. They're alerting the immune system, and deadly at another dose. They're too high, and the immune system goes crazy. And so then the question becomes, is diet of the mother affecting the signaling lipids in her milk? And we don't know the answer to that.
Well,
but we're
I was
looking
disappointed to note in this paper that you were only looking at the local population of mothers and not somebody like the Chimene, where you could get an evolutionary control.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I'm sure you would have loved to have done
that. Yeah. And again, if research funding was looking at mothers and infants more, but that's our goal, is to understand the progress of lipid signaling in mothers in different metabolic states, in different nutritional states, and how much can that help babies? Because one of our goals is premature infants. One of the great achievements of modern medicine is to be able to save these babies. So more and more babies are being born premature for problems of the mother, but medicine is able to keep them alive, but we don't know how to nourish them.
Right.
And it's desperately important. They will suffer from more health risks lifelong because they were born premature. So over 10% of babies this year will be born premature. That's a massive fraction of the country's population will start life this way.
And then there's an additional large number that are born via C-section, often because they're effectively born obese.
Yeah. The mother-infant pair should be this massively important priority for health research and delivery.
Right.
Knowing what you know, how long do you think, again, this is a political correctness free zone, so we're just going to talk about facts.
Okay.
How long should a child, if they can, be able to breastfeed, ideally, based on what you've seen?
Anthropologically, humans breastfed routinely for 2 years. Now, that doesn't mean exclusive breastfeeding. What happened was they were exclusively breastfed for somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And babies, after when that period, they're crawling around, they're putting just about anything in their mouth. And so, and then you start introducing foods. So the fundamental question is, as they ramp up their exposure to the environment, does having breast milk as well help them? And all indications are absolutely. What you want to do is gradually, over the period of 2 years, diminish breast milk consumption and gradually increase everything else. But we typically wean today boom, go to a wellness visit at 6 months. Mother says, "Oh, can I start introducing solid foods?" Pediatrician says, "You got a healthy baby here." Boom. And of course, we expect mothers back to work. We expect them to be, in essence, going about their professional activities and not giving them any support whatsoever for the breastfeeding, for providing milk to their baby, etc. We could fix that and make 2 years entirely possible. And the irony is, these would be healthier citizens in their 70s.
Right.
So if a child is eating,
we're looking at a country now where 90% of the people are metabolically unhealthy, and it's starting here.
So if a child is eating solid food, they can still, and they're still doing breastfeeding, they can still get that bacteria supplement and help them in the long term, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
that's a good
lots
news
of things
for
are
folks
helping.
that are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just amazing to me that we don't pay mothers to breastfeed. I mean, what are we thinking? I mean, it's so much more valuable than formula. We subsidize formula.
Yep.
What are we thinking? In fact, I mean, you know as well as I, when you want someone to help you with a project, you don't say, take this. You say, what will it take for you to do this with me? You know, extend your imagination. Anything you'd like would make this possible. I'll do it for you. We should do that for every mother. What would it take? We want to make this possible.
Breastfeeding's inconvenient. I mean, that's one reason a lot of women stop.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife's a lactation consultant. It's tough work.
Right.
Yeah. Valuable jobs are tough. We compensate people to do them.
What about
we should make it so that they're just delighted to do it.
What is there? What besides from the potential, detrimental effects for the mother, or if there are, and then of course the social pressures? Is there a point at which breastfeeding becomes a negative for the health? You know what I mean? I mean, just hypothetically speaking, why do we stop? If it's
certainly by your 30s, I would think.
Well, yeah, there's the anthropological issue is in a reproductive model, mothers have to move on to their next child.
Right.
So basically, there's what's called the anthropological conflict. The baby has 100% investment in milk. It would like to be breastfed till its 30s. Mothers have basically a certain
other ideas.
But they at some point like to move on to the next baby or the next part of their lives.
Right.
What about raw milk from cows and sheep and goat and all that? Because I've seen some people who have trouble getting their children to have breast milk. They don't want to put the soy formula, so they get the goat powder milk or things like that. Are those things better than soy formula?
Yeah, that's and a little more broadly, if you could just speak to some of the better alternatives to, I mean, if you can't breastfeed and there are circumstances where you can't, what are the good alternatives that are out there? I mean, I noticed at one point in your life you were working with Nestle, and they're obviously a huge manufacturer of infant formulas, so I'm sure you've thought about this.
Oh yeah, and I mean, every baby needs to be fed, and you're faced with that fundamental dilemma: is if the mother can't for any reason, you have to have an alternative, and then the question becomes, how should you approach that? When Henry Nestle invented infant formula, basically he saved lives of babies because he gave them a viable alternative. But
which is a really important thing to note. I mean, it may not be the best solution, but if your alternative is dying, it's a wonderful solution.
It's a wonderful solution. Yeah. But now we have to start saying, okay, what can the entire breastfeeding experience teach us about how to nourish babies? And if you just use the language, milk and formula, the one word for each of them implies that milk's a constant. It doesn't change. It's the same for every baby. And therefore, we can have one formula for every stage of that baby and and of course, milk changes all the time. It's different day 1 than day 3. It's different than day 20. I mean, there are things going on. We talked about the flavors are different depending on each mother. So if we looked at the actual breastfeeding process, then we would start developing in a different way how to nourish each baby. And you're starting to see that. You're starting to see companies question the simple model of infant formula. Can we nourish better? Can we guide those babies to a direction that protects them from what they're going to be faced with, helps their immune system develop, etc. But in order to do that, you've got to invest in it. You got to understand what you're doing, invest in the model of what is it we're going after, and then in the ways to achieve it.
So let's speak hypothetically. Suppose you have a baby puppy. Is raw cow milk a good idea if they don't have access to human milk? Let's put it that way.
To mother's milk.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a great question. And that's
We'll
exactly the question.
We'll put it for puppies today.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of question that we want our young scientists to be asking, to start looking at those comparisons, and that's part of the genius of lactation. Is if you look at different mammalian mother-infant pairs, there's some really impressive strategies to get that baby successful, and so if you look carefully at that infant, lo and behold, the milk is pretty close to what that baby needs. At the same time, milk writ large is different than just about any other kind of food. I mean, there are certain constants that mammalian evolution have come up with. So one of the things that you'll love this. So if you look at milk from a genetic perspective, right, just look at lactation and all the genes that go to make up milk and its components, and then ask across mammalia, from marsupials to humans, which part of the genome associated with lactation has been most defended across that entire diversity of mammalia, of the various biomolecule classes, which seems to be the most important to defend through evolution? I bet you know, Tucker.
I would guess lipids.
It's the lipids.
But that's my answer to everything, so it doesn't really.
It's true. So at its core, lactation is the most defended subset of the human genome. So it appears to be the most important subset of our genome. And if you look at lactation per se, it's a lipid delivery system.
Well, and why that would surprise anybody is a mystery. I mean, it's the best energy source for your body. It's preferentially digested. It bypasses the liver because your body's like, oh, goody, fat. This is what we're looking for. Here, send it in. And apparently it goes straight from the gut to the baby.
Yeah. It's so valuable. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So what is the Tucker, what is that fat that you were talking about that's in milk that you said may have some promising health? It's some word that I don't know how to pronounce with an H or something. Does that, you were talking to me about it before?
Oh, I'm not sure. Oh no, there are some. So well, that's kind of an interesting topic. You know, Harvard University has patented a trans fatty acid. I forget the exact formula of it, but it's a trans palmitoleic acid. So
palmitoleic acid, absolutely.
So it's you know, palmitic acid is what your body gets from milk, and also what your body turns carbohydrates into, and then your body turns that into a monounsaturated fat, and then this is a trans version of that. And Harvard has actually patented it for the health benefits. Dariush Mozaffarian, who's a famous nutritional researcher and cardiologist, was the one who did that. And they've come to realize that that fat, possibly some odd chain fatty acids, heptadecanoic and pentadecanoic. There's even some papers speculating that these saturated fatty acids may be essential to human health, because it seems that if we don't get them, we get these diseases like, oh, I don't know, diabetes. But diabetes isn't really a health problem in the United States, so I don't know why we'd worry about that.
Yeah, why would we?
Yeah, exactly. Can you? I mean, this is obviously way more in your wheelhouse than it is in mine.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on these minute components of fat and mother's milk?
Oh yeah. Well, and palmitoleic acid is fascinating. So Gökhan Hotamishvili at Harvard was the one who discovered what palmitoleic acid seems to do. in a rodent model. So they were studying the fuel metabolism in rodents, and why is it that rodents regulate their body fat food intake beautifully on a high carbohydrate diet, and yet if you give them a higher fat diet, then boom, they get overweight and diabetic. In fact, it was the consistency of that observation that led people to believe that a high carbohydrate diet was safe for humans. But still, no one could figure out how do mice do it. And so what Gokhan found is something that actually, when you think about it, is rather intuitive. So if I'm turning glucose, carbohydrate, into fat, what that means is I don't need the glucose anymore. And so I'm going to store it. And so I'd love to know when that point happens. When do I start, when I got too much glucose and I start making it into fat for storage, I could probably start altering my metabolism accordingly. Well, it turns out when you synthesize fat from carbohydrate, glucose, or fructose or anything, you make palmitic acid, but palmitic acid at some point has to be desaturated to get a monoinsaturate so it doesn't crystallize. And
crystallize, that would be bad, I would guess.
That would be bad. Right. So actually there's a race between the enzyme that makes palmitic acid 2 carbons longer, stearic acid, and desaturates it to normally oleic acid. But if you're making fat really fast, the desaturase, in essence, starts acting first, and you start desaturating at the 16 carbon chain length.
Now that's the SCD1 enzyme.
That's right. And so a hallmark, in fact, clinicians have recognized this decades ago. Someone who's gaining weight, they have more palmitoleic acid because what they're doing is synthesizing fat from carbohydrate. So we should have known. If a chemist can see this, then probably biology can too. So what Gokhan discovered is palmitoleic acid is a signaling molecule. And when the adipose starts in the mouse, starts turning carbohydrate into fat, the palmitoleic acid goes back into blood, goes to the liver, and tells the liver an obvious thing: stop making glucose. It shuts down gluconeogenesis because the adipose is telling the liver, I'm having to turn the glucose into fat here. Stop this.
Right. The production line is saying, I don't want any more raw materials. We're overwhelmed here. But so you're saying that if it goes from palmitic to stearic to oleic, that signal doesn't develop. It's when it's too much palmitic, and then you have a problem in the production line and you start producing palmitoleic. That's the signal that we're overwhelmed. Stop.
Yeah. And so back it feeds to the liver, stop making glucose. It tells the muscle, start pulling out glucose, right? It's your job. Use up that glucose. And it signals the brain, stop eating. We're good here.
Right.
And so you can see.
So that's inducing insulin resistance, right?
No,
palmitoleic?
No. Well, what it's doing is actually stopping
it would be insulin sensitizing in the liver because it's saying stop producing. Right.
Stop producing glucose, muscle take it up, stop eating. It regulates fuel metabolism beautifully. Right. And that's why mice do such a good job on a high carbohydrate diet, because they've got a signaling system built in that when they start eating too much, it shuts down food intake and increases activity, which is exactly what you'd like to do.
And
however,
if you suppress that SCD1 enzyme in mice, you get lots of really interesting effects. Like they don't get fat, but they also can't produce enough heat to keep themselves warm.
They get in trouble. But what if you feed a mouse a higher fat diet? So now it's not synthesizing fat from carbohydrate, it's just storing it. It doesn't produce palmitoleic acid. You basically break the signaling system, and the mouse just keeps eating because there's no signal to say stop.
Although
Wait.
There are some papers. Amir Taha is working with a fellow, Christopher Ramsden, who you of course know, who published a paper back in 2012 looking at the fatty acid composition that's obesogenic. And they came to the conclusion that linoleic acid was uniquely it through the effect on the endocannabinoid system induced overeating.
So the signaling system of palmitoleic acid that Gökhan Hotamishvili discovered, he called these lipokines, a class of signaling molecules from metabolism back to the control of metabolism. Wonderful, explained the mouse. The problem is we're not mice.
Right.
The mouse converts carbohydrate to fat in the adipose. And so the whole system works very well. Humans, we synthesize fat in our liver. And so the system with palmitoleic acid doesn't seem to work. So a high carbohydrate diet doesn't seem to be protective for us at all. In fact, what it starts to do is build up fat in our liver, which is not what you want.
Is that even without a high consumption of seed oil or linoleic acid rich omega-6? That still does that, a high carbohydrate diet to humans?
It looks like, but unfortunately, we have not done that experiment.
Right.
There's just so much seed oil out there that we don't know. But it looks like a high carbohydrate diet could be problematic for humans, even without the presence of overconsumption of linoleic acid from seed oil type foods. Is that right? Yeah, quite possible. Yeah.
Interesting.
But the real problem is what we'll call the hyperphagic state. If you consume more calories than you need, that's called hyperphagia. Then how you deal with that is going to dictate how quickly and how ill you get.
Right.
And so what triggers the hyperphagic state? We don't know that. We know it in mice because of Gökhan's work with palmitoleic acid. Is if you don't have palmitoleic acid, you're going to keep eating because you think you need fuel. And the system that says, like your gas gauge, I don't need any more fuel, is broken. So that's what causes hyperphagia in mice. That's all you need. Break the palmitoleic acid signal, away it goes. We don't know what the equivalent is in humans, unfortunately. As soon as we do, then we'll stop eating too much. Right now, we're focused on if we're eating too much, what causes us to go in this trajectory, what causes us to go in this trajectory, what causes this. And so if you have lots of fructose, your liver is going to be in real trouble because fructose is going to, in essence, produce a fatty liver and all sorts of metabolic problems in your liver.
Even if you're a child?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, especially.
Oh, yeah, especially if you're a child.
Children should not be eating a lot of fructose then, you're suggesting.
Oh, they sure shouldn't.
Wow.
But
why?
I mean, there are some interesting, probably the most important thing to me about this whole question is looking at NAFLD, which is a new disease.
What is that again?
Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, right? It used to be you would get fatty liver disease and it meant you were an alcoholic. And then they had grandmas who started showing up with fatty liver disease and swore that they'd never touched a drop of alcohol in their life, right? And the doctors were like, yeah, sure, Granny, you're, nipping in the back of the church or whatever. Now, 30% of Americans have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and there's no question that it's not associated with alcohol consumption. But, this is a new disease in like the 60s and 70s, I think, is when it started getting recognized. So whatever's causing this has got to be something that changed in the human diet around that period of time, one would think. Just, why wasn't it? Or maybe something that left the human diet, to your point about these bacteria that we used to have. Something.
Yeah. And in fact, it could be two things. It could be the fundamental switch that says you need more fuel, you don't need more fuel. If you eat more than you need, the hyperphagic switch is gone wrong. But once you start on that trajectory, there are components of the diet that will make it worse or not as bad. And so we seem to have confused that. So this is what makes it possible for the sugar industry to demonstrate that fructose isn't so bad. If you burn all the fructose you eat, you're okay.
Right.
Right? As long as you're burning it, you're okay. However, if you consume more fructose than you burn, then you have to start storing it. You can't store it, you convert it into fat in your liver. And that has the metabolic toxicity to your liver. So what you want, wouldn't it be nice if I could know how much fructose did I eat today? How active was I? And then I could make sure I never had more fructose than I burned. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of system in place.
You're leading us into one of your favorite topics here, I see.
Well, I mean, if we could,
when we discussed last time around the dietary guidelines, you mentioned something called personalized nutrition, which is, I mean, you touched on in this breast milk discussion. So why don't you tell us your position on personalized nutrition? Because that's something I really wanted to hear. It's a fascinating concept. And obviously something that, you know, our one size fits all dietary guidelines have been an unmitigated disaster, one would have to say.
Right. And it's clear that, and what milk has instructed us step after step is that diet's really important, but it's not always the same. And so what's important as a diet in one state may be different than in another state. And each of us transition through different states as a function of our age, activity. And so we need to be able to nourish that person that we are, and ideally nourish the person we'd like to be. And use diet to make us healthier, happier, more performant, joyous people. But in order to do that, we'd have to know what food is. And we don't do that now.
Right. Well, we have the USDA database, which is what all these online calculators, food calculators use.
Right. But
so what
that's
is food?
basically it's a vitamin. So the USDA keeps track of vitamins and minerals, the essential nutrients, which they have to do. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And as we talked about earlier, you've got to get all of your essential nutrients.
Right.
And we've been doing that for almost a century now very well. But is that enough to be healthy? Clearly not. So we're going to have to measure the other stuff in food accurately and then start delivering on that compositional information to people according to their needs and desires. And ironically, there is a model for this that is already in place. Google Maps, right? I mean, it's so simple. Google Maps takes advantage of a compositional database. All the streets and roads and bike paths and highways, all in the cloud. And then our personal device is equipped with algorithms to interrogate that database and solve for a very simple value proposition. Where am I now? Where would I like to be? How do I get there? And that what actually is a massively complicated problem is routine now, real time. So imagine, what's my health today? What would I like it to be? How do I get there? And that's going to require the sort of computational solutions that Google Maps provides for travel. You can't get there without knowing what food is in some detail, any more than if you didn't know what roads were out there, you go where you wanted to go.
Right. So Google Maps wouldn't work without the road database.
Right.
So what is food?
So that's coming.
So what is food in this equation here?
Right. You got to know the proteins in detail. You got to know the lipids in detail. You've got to know the carbohydrates. So, I mean, it's outrageous that going into a global pandemic, of an infectious respiratory disease that will kill you because of inflammation in your lungs, we don't know how much linoleic acid is in our diet.
Amen to that.
Right.
Yeah.
What are we thinking? We've got an epidemic of excess accumulation of fat in key metabolic tissues of our teenagers. And yet they have no idea how much fructose they consume in a day. What's wrong with this?
Or even better, the schools, although they're starting to get better, are serving Coke, and orange juice at the.
But don't worry, Tucker. They've got
the cafeteria.
But don't worry, they've got some greens too. Arugula sometimes if you go to a nice school. So
yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what you need to compensate for the Coke.
But again, the amount of knowledge is not trivial, but it's not ludicrous. Most of the calculations would be easier than Google Maps.
How would you calculate it? Like a test, a blood test, or what is it? What would?
No. I mean, so most of the things you'd want to do, activity, which your phone does now, about how many calories do I need? And then it would say, okay, this is what you've been eating. Right now, we have this bizarre model based on the multinational corporations' view of food, branded, packaged food products. And we talk about them being as good or bad. And so that what's kept coming into the public's perception is there's such a thing as a good food and a bad food. Well, that's nonsense. It's the diet overall, right? To our Google Maps metaphor, it's not like Old Davis Road sends me an advertisement in the mail. Oh, come and spend some time on Old Davis Road. we're the best road ever, right? A road is valuable to the extent it gets us where we want to go. And the same thing is true of food. A food that is good for one person is going to be bad for another person because it's not getting them where they want to go. In order to know what it is, you have to have the map. Now, the beauty of Google Maps is that if you want to go from A to B by bike, you can. It tells you. By foot, you want to walk. By bus, by train, it's personalized. If you want to get a coffee along the way, it tells you, sure, here it is. And in fact, the purveyors of goods and services pay for the whole thing. They want access to the people who are going to be nearby wanting a coffee. So imagine that for health, right? Will we solve for all the calcium you need, the vitamin C you need, the linoleic, etc.? Of course we will. Will we be able to understand what foods deliver that? Sure we will. Will we need, in essence, to force you to eat it? No. They'll say, David, I know what you like. Tell us more, and we'll make sure that you can have access to the foods that you need that are also delicious for you.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that always trips people up with a diet are the quote unquote cheats. And with a model like this, you could just build in cheats. You could say, oh, you've been, you're totally fine having an ice cream tonight, or whatever it might be, or, my personal bête noire, French fries, probably the worst food known to man.
Not if they're
oxidized seed oils and oxidized.
Not if they're tallow fried. Not if they're tallow fried, right?
Not if they're tallow fried, yes. But if you're getting them at McDonald's, they're not tallow fried anymore, sadly.
Well, but what if it, in essence, said, not only, Tucker, would you like French fries? This is how many you should have, and you should have them.
Right. Enjoy.
They're going to be good for you. It changes the whole way we think about food. And I think that's where we're going. We're making the whole system transparent so you can see your own health, you can see your own diet, and you can take decisions. Now, just like Google Maps makes the travel system transparent, Google Maps didn't lead to in essence, didn't build roads. Google's not out there building roads. What Google made possible is destinations. That now people realize, I'd love to see mountains. Now I know how to get there. I'd love to see a beach. I know how to get there. So all of the people who have cool destinations can get to the people who'd like to get there. So what Google Maps did really is enable travel to new destinations. So the equivalent metaphorically for food will allow us to pursue health the way we personally would like to have it. Instead of just fleeing from disease, we can start going in a direction where we're literally in control of our own health.
Right.
So going back,
wouldn't be a bad future.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Going back to the foundation, you talked about the blueprint of nutrition being, breast milk for humans. So when you're transitioning from a child going to go on to solid foods exclusively, I would imagine that the roadmap would be a lot more universal at that stage for humans, relatively speaking, in case there's, some extreme situations with the child. But children all kind of start off in the same boat as compared to an 80-year-old versus a 30-year-old or different things like that. So, so let's start there. Knowing what just give us your personal take on what do you think is a diet that optimizes the composition of the food as close to the blueprint being breast milk. What would that look like?
Well, there's a variable dimension and a fixed dimension. So in terms of what should every child get, absolutely. And milk schools us very well on that. But there are some fundamental things that we are not even measuring, much less are we acting upon. So one of the horrors of the modern world is that we're hyperphagic. We are consuming more calories than we need, and we're getting overweight as a result. And so everybody's pursuing ways to restrict food intake to stop that. But let's look at that the way we should. If you're eating more calories than you need, it's not the calories that are stored that's the problem, it's the calories you're not using to play that are the problem. Children should play all day, every day, because we have this massive brain that we have to experience to train about cause and effect, the relationships between us, our social peers, everything else. We have to experience in order to train our brains to do that. If we don't move, we don't train our brains. Children, when they're happy and healthy, drive their parents crazy because they move so much. And they're moving because they're playing. They're laughing. They're having literally the times of their life. And what you want to do with that child is not restrict fuel, because they're using the fuel. And what we're doing is making the goal consuming less fuel, which means playing less. What we want to say is, what's the switch? What's the switch that says I should divert this fuel to storage versus divert this fuel to play? When we figure that switch out, then every child will play when they want.
That's one of the, that's one of the strongest pieces of evidence I've seen. I think it was Dr. Lustig, the anti-sugar crusader, who talked about obese children who had hyperinsulinemia. And when you blocked through a tumor, right? So this is not a normal model, but if you blocked the production of insulin from the tumor, they lost weight. But the first thing they did was get up and start playing, because the hyperinsulinemia was a signal to the body to, insulin's a signal to store fat to some extent. And in these kids, it was grossly dysregulated. But what always struck me was his comment: as soon as you shut down that insulin signal, the kids get up and start running around and playing. Before that, they're sedentary.
Right. They play. And the joy of that is every child will play differently.
Right.
Some will run around, some will get on bikes, some will get an instrument and play it. And to me, that's
you burn a lot of calories thinking too, thinking.
Right. You burn a lot of calories smiling.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about humans is something that needs fuel. And we need to realize that we can produce calories to make the happiest, healthiest, most active children in history.
Right.
And instead,
you say this as schools are dropping recess because it's too much trouble, and then they're cutting back on the calories they're serving the kids in the cafeteria. because they're required to follow the dietary guidelines, which don't recognize that, kids need to eat a lot of calories.
Right. What are we doing putting kid chairs in classrooms?
Right.
Kids don't want to sit down. They want to play. We should imagine an environment that they learn maximally as they move. But yeah.
What would you say to parents who, and again, I don't want to be offensive to anybody or whatever, but I mean, we're just talking about the facts as you've seen them scientifically here. It's like, what would you say to folks who say, "Oh, they're kids. Let them have the Kool-Aid and the French fries and the Oreos and the Reese's cup." And then to add to their point, what they typically do is they say, "Well, look how slender my child is. They're perfectly fine. They've been eating this way, French fries and Happy Meals and chicken McNuggets loaded with linoleic acid and sugar, and they're slender. They look perfectly fine. Kids are tough little cookies. Don't be such a helicopter and tell them not to eat that stuff." What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, part of the problem of the diversity of the human condition is you do have some children and some adults who are perplexingly functional in this environment. But I would argue you're healthy and happy until you aren't.
And it's a small minority of people at this point. That's like 10, 12% of the
smaller.
population.
Yeah.
Is it really though for children though for a second? Because if you think about it, you don't see too many. I mean, they do say there's obese children, but you typically see kids are pretty slender and they're eating McNuggets and Happy Meals every day. So what's causing that?
Yeah.
Why is that the way?
Again, since we don't know what this switch is that causes kids, instead of getting up and playing, to sit down and store fuel, right? So, I mean, there has to be a switch because it's a biologically important decision. So if you look at what's called imprinting, that's the window of time early in life when every organism senses its environment and develops appropriately. So the classic example, there's a little marine crab. And if the mother crab is in a perfectly benign environment, lots of food, no predators, she lays her eggs, they hatch, they have no shells. But if that crab is in a hostile environment, lots of predators, unpleasant circumstances, not much food, she lays the eggs, they're born, and they all have shells. So they've, in essence, sensed their environment and made a phenotypic decision. So now let's take animate organisms that can move. If you find yourself in an affluent environment, lots of calories, lots of food, what happens? You grow big, you start moving all over, you start to make more of whatever you are, you dominate your environment. That's the way biology works. However, if you're in a hostile environment early in life, not much food, not much, in essence, calories, and predators, and all of the things that are threatening, what do? You don't get big. You stay small. You don't move. And any calories you get, you prioritize storage so that you can last long enough for times to get better. So this is literally a species-saving decision that every organism has to make. So since we're sensing our environment and making important systemic decisions, that means if we got it wrong, there could be consequences. So what would happen? Let's say you're a worm, right? You either grow big and race around and make more worms, or stay small, stay still, and store. Right? So what would a worm look like if it thought it was in a calorie-poor, hostile environment, but it was really in a calorie-rich environment? What would it look like?
I'm presuming it would be obese because it would have this storage
phenotype. Look like Jabba the Hutt on Star Wars. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
It'd be a sedentary fat kid. And what are we up to our behinds in? Sedentary fat kids.
Right.
So we need to understand that switch.
And we don't know what the switch is, you're saying?
We don't. And in fact, there may be more than one. But people like Jeff Gordon, Marty Blazer, have made a compelling argument that part of that switch is the microbial community in us that's producing fuels. And those fuels are signal molecules. And they're telling us life is good, get out there and play, or life is tough, stay in, store.
Like butyrate, which probably most people who are interested in these dietary topics have heard of, is produced in the colon and seems to have all sorts of beneficial systemic effects.
So that's
I mean, again, we're getting back into this area we discussed before, where there's a lot of interesting science and not a lot of interesting answers. Yeah,
Brad, it could be palmitoleic acid.
Yeah,
it could be palmitoleic acid. Breast milk has lots of palmitoleic acid, not as much as palmitic, but one of the richest sources of palmitoleic acid that there is.
Right.
So maybe your mother is encouraging it to be active metabolically.
The switch that makes you go into a lethargic state. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Versus a playful state.
Huh. Brad, Tucker and I have a friend, Brad Marshall. I had him on and he was talking about the role that he thinks of PUFA contributing to torpor. This idea that sounds familiar. It sounds the similar thing that what you're talking about, where you want to be low energy and get ready for hibernation. And these PUFA fats that are found in these colder climates, right? These colder climates where these PUFA fats are in the nature would be triggering a switch to be getting into a state of low energy where you're wanting to, store body fat, right? Would that make sense? Right. The same thing here?
It would.
Is it the same thing?
But I mean, it tells us we should look there.
Right.
But it's complicated. If we take DHA as the most polyunsaturated fatty acid, it's abundant in the muscle tissue of high-speed swimming fish. So it's possible.
Also cold water fish as well.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So these guys. So it may be that in them DHA signals, muscle building and speed, whereas another point in evolution. That's why Gokon's work with mice showed how mice regulate this process, but they're not necessarily appropriate for us. They make their fat in adipose. We synthesize fat in our liver. So it's fundamentally important that we prioritize this kind of research to figure these signaling systems out, and do it early in life. And our argument is breast milk has done a lot of the heavy lifting for us.
Right.
It's already had to go for over 200 million years of mother-infant, in essence, selective pressure.
Producing optimal outcomes by definition.
Right.
Does
so
breast
it's a Darwinian engine.
Breast milk has sugar in it, but does it seem to indicate, again, as a blueprint, that children should be eating relatively low carbohydrate, or does it not give us information to suggest that? Because you did mention watching out for fructose, but of course there's other sources of carbohydrates that may be better for you or something.
Well, and again, we should be looking at the structure and function of every fatty acid in milk. We should be looking at the structure and function of every carbohydrate, every sugar. Everybody thinks that sugar is sugar. Glucose is the same as fructose, is the same as galactose. No, they're not.
They're metabolized very differently.
Very differently.
Right.
And
what are the sugars what were the sugars that the human breast milk wants to preferentially provide the child out of those different categories of sugars?
Well, it's got lots of glucose and galactose as lactose. And it has, in essence, oligosaccharides, the basis of which is lactose. And then it adds either fucose or sialic acid. So there are lots of sugars in breast milk that the mother makes at huge cost and then puts in the milk for the baby. And so it's a reasonable biological assumption to say there must be a reason why mothers would dissolve themselves to put this in milk. What could it be?
Right. None of
And
this process is irrational. I mean, it may be not, I mean, there may be some quirks that were efficient design decisions at some point, but the whole process is profoundly rational.
right.
If I want to
Yeah.
wrap things up, but I want to ask you if you could have a blank check to do your perfect scientific study, what would you want to do? You know what I mean? If you, knowing what you know and all the question marks that remain, what would be something that you would want to investigate, and you, or just anybody in general, where you say, man, if we didn't have the limitations of, because you said there's so limited funding in this field, and I just wanted to
Yeah.
know, what would it be, your ideal study, if you could get it together?
Yeah. Oh, David, this is why you get the big bucks. This is the killer question. Yeah. Well, so if it was me, I would say that we need to know what milk does for babies short term and long term. We need to understand this window of, for lack of a better term, imprinting. What does that do for the human potential? It's a big study. You said lots of money. I would follow all babies and I would build a database. So I have no clue whether I was breastfed and how long. The most important dietary decision of my life, I have no clue what it was.
Right.
So
Yeah, me too.
Follow and start looking. What is milk doing for babies? What are the bacteria doing? Acute, of course, but I would want to know, does this, in essence, support socialization? Because Katie Hind, a brilliant anthropologist and studies milk and lactation, she shows that milk affects socialization, not just early in life, which means your curiosity, your anxiety, your ability to deal with peers, with older and younger individuals. Wouldn't we love to know how we socialize? Diet affects that.
Right.
And
Is
then,
it because
then
of the
there's
child being connected to the mother longer, or the material in the actual milk that's
actual
driving it?
material in the milk?
Huh.
Right. And then there are things that we know we have flexibility in early in life that we lose. We'd love to get them back. You give an 8-year-old a violin, in 4 years, they can be playing in Carnegie Hall. You give me a violin today, I'm going to be still. What if I could expand the elasticity of my neuromuscular memory? So now I could start playing music.
Well, that's one of the really interesting findings. Is this young blood, these experiments that they've done where they take blood component out, and even if they replace it with just saline, basically the animal seems to get younger, and it makes you wonder what's going on between their mouth and their bloodstream, that their blood seems to be almost toxic to the organism.
Right. Well, and so all of these things would start to emerge as we took health seriously.
Right.
And if we just look at middle-aged rich white men, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
If we look at humans, we'll see this is how you nourish the healthiest, happiest, most performant, joyous humans in history. And archaeologists would recognize it when they dug us up. They would say, what happened in 2022? All of a sudden, people started to get more diverse, more active. So yeah, I think I'd love to have the opportunity to guide that scientific decision.
Wow, it's been a real fun time for talking with you, and we've got many more questions that have arisen from this discussion, but we'll leave it here for now. Tucker, any final thoughts or question?
No, it's been a really, as expected, a really eye-opening discussion that went in some directions I wasn't anticipating, which is, of course, what always makes these discussions fun. Thank you very much for your time today, Professor German.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, both of you. This has been an exciting morning. I'll remember this for a long time.
Well, this answers one question. Does milk do the body good? Yes, we figured that out. As to how exactly, we're not fully sure.
We don't know. Yeah, but for all young people thinking, what career would keep me happy the rest of my life? Yeah, join us in working with milk.
Very cool. Thanks a lot for your time, Professor German.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.